Part 2, the genre of John's Gospel. In the course of his education, in all probability, John was introduced to a type of literature that was called bioi, from the Greek word bios, meaning life. We would call this biography. There were many bioi in circulation in John's day. And as it turned out, the first Christian century was a great century for the production of biography. Some years ago, Paul Murray Kendall observed that the first Christian century, quote, gave birth to the three first truly professional biographers, Plutarch and Suetonius and the historian Tacitus. But biography had a long history dating from the poet Ion of Chios in the 5th century BC. Kendall also fittingly said this, quote, "The two greatest teachers of the classical Mediterranean world, Socrates and Jesus Christ, both prompted the creation of magnificent biographies written by their followers." End of quote. Plato's Apology and his Phaedo, as we have seen, are biographical dialogues related to Socrates. In those dialogues, Plato brilliantly recreates the response of an extraordinary character to the crisis of existence. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, of course, are biographies focused on Jesus Christ. We have already noted that Plato's Apology and Phaedo concentrate on the last days of Socrates. The Phaedo takes place on his very last day, while the Apology is his defense before the Athenian jury that condemned him. That defense took place nearly a month before his execution. In the case of Jesus, the historical sequence was different. First, there was his last meeting with his closest disciples, John 13 to 17. But subsequently, that very night, Jesus is arrested, tried, executed the following morning, and buried the same day. In John's Gospel, this is chapters 18 and 19. You will notice, of course, that John spends a lot of time on these two events. They are, number one, Jesus' final conversation with his friends, John 13 to 17. And number two, Jesus' final confrontation with his enemies, John 18 to 19. I hope you guys in the audience noticed the homiletical tone of that. His final conversation, his final confrontation, free of charge. I want to suggest that the effort John makes to describe these scenes in detail is harmonious with the practice of biographers before and during the first Christian century. Let us consider this for a few minutes. Part 3, death scenes in ancient biography. At this point, we need to recall the request that Echecrates made to Phaedo, which resulted in the dialogue which followed. I quote again, Echecrates, "I wish you would be kind enough to give us a really detailed account, unless you are pressed for time." Phaedo, "No, not at all. I will try to describe it for you. Nothing gives me more pleasure than recalling the memory of Socrates, either by talking myself or by listening to someone else." Echecrates, "Well, Phaedo, you will find that your audience feels just the same about it. Now try to describe every detail as carefully as you can." Here, obviously, Echecrates is a stand-in for the upper-class hearer or reader whose social set is gathered to listen perhaps to a professional lecturer starting to read Plato's dialogue. The pleasurable occasion must not be spoiled by some brief and superficial account. Echecrates wants detail. Phaedo promises to provide something that can be enjoyed. He loves talking about Socrates. When one considers other instances of ancient biography, it is obvious that the ancient hearer or reader savored details. This is especially clear, I think, when it comes to accounts of a person's death. For example, Plutarch was the most prolific biographer from the first century. He was born in AD 45, only a few years after the crucifixion of our Lord. His birthplace was in Chaeronea in Boeotia in central Greece. Plutarch received training in philosophy at Athens and taught that subject later at Rome. The Emperor Trajan granted him consular rank, and later Hadrian gave him the position of procurator in Greece. He wrote in Koine Greek. Plutarch's monumental accomplishment in the field of biography is the multi-volume work that we know as Parallel Lives. This series contains 46 biographies, mostly broken up into pairs, one member of the pair being a Greek person, and the other member a similar Latin person. The last 4 lives, however, are single. The purpose of the Parallel Lives was not simply to retell historical facts, but to offer moral examples and/or moral warnings. The list of the subjects of these biographies is quite long, and I won't bore you with the whole list. But the list includes such pairs as Solon and Publicola, Themistocles and Camillus, Pericles and Fabius Maximus, Lysander and Sulla, Dion and Brutus. You get the idea. Picking somewhat at random, Plutarch's narrative of the death of Cicero is illustrative of my point. Plutarch's account can be said to run from chapters 46 through 49 of his life of Cicero. Plutarch recounts how Cicero was betrayed by Octavian, whom he had helped to gain political power. Octavian resisted but eventually gave in to the demands of Antony and Lepidus that Cicero be proscribed, that is, designated for execution. When news of the proscription reached Cicero in his country home in Tusculum, he and his brother Quintus decided to flee to a seacoast residence Cicero had at Asturia. They then planned to sail to a place called Brutus in Macedonia, but Quintus later got cold feet and left Cicero, only to be killed not long after by his own servants. Cicero sailed from Asturia and reached Carchaeum. But instead of sailing on at once, as his servants urged, he went ashore and walked 100 furlongs back toward Rome. Listen now to Plutarch's account of Cicero's irresolution, quote, "But again, losing resolution and changing his mind, he went down to the sea at Asturia. And there he spent the night in dreadful and desperate calculations. He actually made up his mind to enter Caesar's house by stealth, to slay himself upon the hearth, and to fasten upon Caesar an avenging demon. But a fear of tortures drove him from this course also." End of quote. Cicero now sails off to a summer villa he had at Caeta. But as he sailed, quote, "A flock of crows flew with loud clamor towards the vessel of Cicero as it was rowed toward land. And alighting at either end of the sail yard, some cawed, and others pecked at the end of the ropes. And everybody thought that the omen was bad." End of quote. It was bad. At the end of this remarkable story, we eventually find the assassin Herennius overtaking Cicero in his litter. And, quote, "Cicero, perceiving him, ordered the servants to set the litter down where they were. Then he himself, clasping his chin in his left hand, as was his custom, looked steadfastly at the slayers, his head all squalid and unkempt, and his face wasted with anxiety, so that most of those that stood by covered their faces while Herennius was slaying him. For he stretched his neck forth from the litter and was slain, being in his 64th year. End of quote. You see what I mean? This is a very detailed account. Plutarch, of course, didn't see it happen and doesn't scruple to pass on whatever details had reached him in one way or another. He himself would probably not have vouched for the absolute truth of every detail in his narrative. But this is what readers wanted.